One of the things that helped me in learning to play the harmonica was that I realized that I could never speak the way any other individual spoke on the harmonica. Each has their own way of saying things. So I just went ahead and got to a point of learning the instrument well enough that I could speak the way I wanted to speak, which is really a nice thing about this instrument. It's such a personal instrument. It's really like a horn from the heart.
First day I was in Chicago. I was walking around the neighborhood, you know, just trying to... Chicago's a pretty big town, biggest town I'd ever seen, and I saw a guy, a white guy, sitting on some steps in front of an apartment building, playing guitar and drinking a quart of beer, and he was playing blues. I said, wow, this has got to be my type of guy. And I went over and started talking to him, and we, you know, Butterfield, he wasn't playing much harmonica at that time. He played mostly guitar. And shortly after that, he took up the harmonica, and within 6 months, he was a natural genius on the instrument. He just got way good in a short amount of time.
Paul seemed to start at full speed. He would go for it. Absolutely, and he had tremendous courage. I mean, you cannot minimize the courage it took to go into a blues club and sit in. I'm astonished by it.
Tell Automatic Slim, tell Ray's Golden Jim, tell Butch and I told Annie.
I'm here at Silvio's, which was an incredible blues place and the home base of Hal and Wolf. Obviously it's a field right now, and it's been gone so long, there's a tree here. It's huge. And my father, Paul Butterfield, Barry Goldberg, Charlie Musselwhite, they all cut their teeth here. Michael Bloomfield. And the way they cut their teeth here was Wolf would call these guys up on stage to play with them. And what an honor that must have been. And really, if you think, standing on the stage with your heroes at that time didn't make you go home and practice your instrument, you gotta be crazy. This room is definitely a part of my father's sound.
We gon' picture way through all night long. All night long. All night long.
Hyde Park, Illinois, the home of the University of Chicago, is a 1.5 square mile neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Until the early 1950s, Hyde Park was an almost exclusively white community, surrounded on 3 sides by African American communities, many of whose residents had migrated from the South. Beginning in the mid-1950s, Hyde Park became one of Chicago's most racially diverse neighborhoods, at a time when other parts of the country were struggling with race relations.
Things weren't too cool. It was way before civil rights, you know. And even though Chicago was better than Oklahoma, was rough. It was hardcore segregated. And Chicago was a little cooler, but Hyde Park was real cool.
And in that area, surrounding the university, were 50, 60, 70 blues bars, all with a band. There was blues being played by the best of the players. And it was there in Hyde Park that Paul Butterfield was born and raised. The Folklore Society was the biggest organization on campus. It was there I met Paul Butterfield. And it was there we started to do a few things together. I'd play guitar, and he'd play harmonica. We called ourselves Nick and Paul.
Butter and I would go and play at the parties, Nick Gravitas, and we didn't have any money. We would do stuff like wait till everybody got drunk and then go look in the freezer and throw a bunch of steaks in the alley and pick them up on the way home, you know.
At a certain point, the house band at the twist party became Paul and Elvin. And they had a rhythm section known as the Wilson Brothers, a couple of black guys. The band sounded good, and it was an atypically integrated scene racially. Some black young people would come from the neighborhood to dance, and nearby there sat a small piano, which I would wheel out and play along.
This guy named Norman Dayron, he had a tape recorder, and I guess he was a school teacher or professor at the university or something. And one day he told Butterfield and Cotton and me, "You guys want to hear what you sound like?" So he got us to come to this building that was empty. It was in the evening at the University of Chicago, and he set up his walnut sack tape recorder. And it was me and Cotton and Butterfield and Billy Boy Arnold. The good thing about Butter was he was one of the few harmonica players you'll ever see who wasn't totally dominated by Little Walter. Their style is so attractive that it just stops people in their tracks and they can't think of any other way to go, you know? And Butterfield, somehow, he was always himself.
I became aware of Butterfield one night. He showed up at a place I was working with Little Smokey Smothers then, a place called the Blue Flame. He was the only white person in the place at the time, hanging around wanting to get a chance to sit in with the band. After he called the band back off the break, "We're gonna get this white boy up and let him play a little bit." And everybody got quiet. "Hey, what is this white boy gonna do?" He showed them what he could do, you know. He really showed them what he could do, and he kept showing it. People got so the whites would start to coming in this way. "Hey, y'all gonna have that white boy back up there?" You know, the following week. And it just went on and on, and it kept going. It never stopped.
Like all brothers, we struggled, we competed, but we also, old Western movies always had to do with somebody seeking revenge for somebody who killed their brother. So if anybody messed with Paul, I was on it. And the same, if they messed with me, he was on it. So we were rivals and yet very close.
I think I probably first met Paul, I must have been 9 perhaps, because I can remember him, I can remember walking to school and there he was, this antic character on the other side of the street, never just walking. He was hopping or jumping or laughing, and so he decided to throw some stones across the street at me. So that was really my introduction to Paul Butterfield. He was utterly charming, gorgeous looking, with his blue eyes and his dark hair. And who knew that 15 years later I'd become his sister-in-law. He was, for a long time, he was just Peter's younger brother to me.
Our parents certainly provided both of us with every advantage in a sense. Not material things, but exposure to music, the arts, things that they valued, that we valued. So we felt we had a very privileged upbringing.
They grew up without a TV. They grew up listening to classical music all the time.
My grandmother took my dad to the symphony orchestra in Chicago, and he picked out a cellist, I believe it was, that was out of tune.
And she knew right then that he had a special talent. His brother played the clarinet, and Paul took up flute.
Our parents got him a good teacher from the symphony, and he played for a while.
Paul and I went to high school together at the University of Chicago Laboratory School, U-High. The school was wonderful in that it really tried to engage students to be able to be the ones to initiate the ideas. It wasn't a call and response. It wasn't a, now you do this and the answer is that. It was very much conversation based. And lucky for Paul, he was a good talker. He could talk his way out of just about anything. So it was a good place for him to be.
He was not entirely focused student.
Bring raisins with his lunch every day, me throwing those all around, getting in a little trouble, throw a chair out the window. An instigator, yeah.
His energy came out in his singing as well. He was a member of our Jimmy Shanties, which was the name of our high school choir, and he also was involved in various shows. But again, it wasn't that he had such a wonderful voice. It was his energy and his personality that always carried it. He brought to the music an intensity and a passion, and he just worked it until he could do it. And he was a leader. Not a leader in a standard leader sense when you think of somebody who's, says, I will take charge and I will do. It was more the follow me along because I'm having such a good time. That kind of a leader. People wanted to be by him.
After high school, my brother, who was somewhat of an athletic star, first he had had a scholarship to Brown University in track and field. And then he suffered an injury, and so that was kind of out the window. But he did get into University of Illinois. But in the spring and summer, before he would go off to University of Illinois, was when he took his deep plunge into the blues, into the harmonica. The way Paul mastered the harmonica was simply to virtually play it 24/7. He used to go out to a peninsula on the lakefront in Chicago, just north of 57th Street Beach. It was called Promontory Point. I'd go and see him, and I knew not to bother him because he would be totally absorbed in his playing. So by the time he was ready to go to college, he went to college. Let's say he went on a Monday. He stayed through Thursday and came back to Chicago and hung out with his friends and was on the blues scene. And then after a while, he would go on Monday and come back on Tuesday, and then after a while, he wouldn't go at all. So, and nobody had a clue that he was even in town.
I remember I took him to his first club, Smitty's Corners, 35th Street, Muddy Waters Band. And we sort of hustled our way in the door. We're both just young punks, no ID.
And then we would hear things like the police would call and somebody had pulled a car over and there were a bunch of unsavory characters in it, including my brother. And then my father, who, was a lawyer, could go down to the station and get them out.
Paul takes his plunge into the blues at a time when folk music is enjoying a renaissance among American youth. Characterized by acoustic instrumentation and themes of social justice, and led by artists like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and many traditional and contemporary folk musicians, the folk boom of the early 60s spawns thriving folk music scenes in major metropolitan areas and college towns throughout the U.S. In Boston, a young folkie soon to make his own musical mark sets out on a journey across the country in search of new musicians and new sounds.
It was 1961 when I got to Chicago, and I met Paul Butterfield, and I was 21 and he was 19. He must have liked me because we became friends very quickly, and I was glad of it because I didn't know anybody in Chicago, and here I had this guy who was obviously a good musician taking me around to all these places that I never would have been able to see. I never would have seen Muddy Waters at Pepper's Lounge or Howlin' Wolf if Paul hadn't taken me there, and both times we went there, we were the only white people in the place. Yet they all knew Paul, and they treated him just like a friend. I got the feeling like Muddy really liked Paul a lot, and that he was glad to be able to teach him and show him and have somebody, a young person, and specifically a young white person, who could already play great blues harmonica. Both Muddy Waters and I think especially Howlin' Wolf were very powerful, dynamic performers. They were intimidating in a certain way. They were very strong, And I could see that Paul had that kind of quality about him too, even at that young age. So that later on, as he formed the blues band and became well known, that same strong quality was in Paul.
In the early 1960s, Chicago is arguably the urban blues capital of the world. By day, it's the home of the renowned Chess Records, whose roster of stars includes Chuck Berry, Willie Dixon, Howlin' Wolf, and Muddy Waters.
Paul was special. I'd seen him numerous times at Chess, sitting in the musician's waiting room. He'd go up. I don't know he was playing, but they would let him come. You know, he got to know Muddy, he got to know Little Walter, he got to know all the players.
At night, the biggest names in the blues perform at over 100 clubs in the tough black neighborhoods on the city's south and west sides. Paul Butterfield and Nick Gravitas are regulars on this late-night circuit, listening, learning, and sometimes sitting in. Nick carries a pistol for protection. Live blues doesn't arrive on the mostly white north side of Chicago until the summer of 1963, when a bar called Big John's contacts Paul about putting together a band to perform there 4 nights a week.
When Butter first started playing Big John's, it was when he was at a crossroads in his life. Family pressure, get a job, get serious. That's how that band started.
Paul knew what he wanted. He wanted a dynamite rhythm section, and he got the best rhythm section in Chicago. Howlin' Wolf's rhythm section with Jerome Arnold and Sam Lake.
What made me go with Butterfield, he offered me $20 a night, and I was only getting 7 a night with the Wolf. It was just 4 of us, myself, Jerome Arnold, Butterfield, and Elvin Bishop. That's the original band. When I left Wolf, Jerome came with me. So suddenly, Paul Butterfield had Howlin' Wolf's rhythm section. Instant credibility. And the people on the north side went nuts. Not only on the north side, across the country.
It was an idea whose time had come, I think it was kind of overdue. We were at the right place at the right time. The big, beautiful body of music, the blues, the American blues, the black blues, and this huge white audience had never to any extent met, and the idea just caught fire.
There were all sorts of characters. People from Second City would come in, David Steinberg, Robert Klein. Ken Nordine, the great word jazz hipster, would be hustling pool in the back room. There would be socialites coming from the near north side, Lakeshore Drive. There would be robbers, burglars, pimps, whores, anything you can imagine under one flag, the blues.
Butterfield was a legend in Chicago, and word about him was spreading. And Fritz Richmond told Paul Rothschild, Paul, you ought to go see this guy. And he goes to Chicago, and he sees Butterfield, and says to Butterfield, I want to record you. And Butterfield says, okay. And he said, let's go on over to this other place. And they go, and they see Mike Bloomfield playing with the Mike Bloomfield band. And Paul asked the logical question, hey, why isn't Mike playing with your band? He said, I've tried a number of times and I can't get him to do it. Well, Rothschild could pretty much convince anybody of anything. And he got Bloomfield to join the Butterfield Blues Band.
About the time that there was a possibility suddenly of a recording contract, which was something that I don't think Paul or any of the other members of the band ever envisioned happening, Paul got his draft notice. The draft notice was really a death sentence. That's the way we viewed it. I think Paul just saw this as, oh my God, here I almost have it and it's being taken away from me. Enter Virginia McEwen, who was a barmaid at Big John's. She knew of Paul's plight and she offered to marry Paul to keep him out of the draft. She could very well have saved his career and saved his life. Though it wasn't meant as a traditional marriage, They did have a son in 1965, and they were close, but not family close, although later Paul became very involved in Gabriel's life, and it was important to both of them, I think. Another thing about Paul Rothchild is he introduced my brother to Albert Grossman, who was a well-known manager of Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Albert was very taken with Paul's band and gave them a lot of exposure here and then nationwide. And the band went into the studio.
We put them in the studio. I thought it was pretty good, and we pressed up 10,000 copies because the Paul Butterfield Blues Band had a track on sampler number 6, and it was selling well in Chicago, and it turned out to be a Butterfield Blues Band track that was making it happen. I had become a pilot. I'd started flying when I was 1960, and it's now 1964, and I have my own airplane, and we're flying up to visit Tom Rush's aunt on Martha's Vineyard on one beautiful Saturday afternoon, and Paul Rothchild says, I hate to tell you this, but I've listened to the record again and don't think I got it. At which point I put the plane into a shallow dive, scaring the crap out of Rothchild. And I said, you want to tell me that again? And he said, I don't think I got it. I think we've got to scrap the records. I said, what do you mean you don't have it? He said, it's not as good as it could be. Well, that's all you have to say to me. All right, I'll scrap them.
By 1965, young people are tuning into music played on electric, plugged-in instruments. Artists with #1 records that year include the Beatles, the Supremes, the Temptations, the Beach Boys, the Byrds, with Mr. Tambourine Man, a Bob Dylan song, and the Rolling Stones. By the summer of '65, Dylan's Electrified Like a Rolling Stone is on the radio everywhere. Many in the folk scene view this electric music as a threat to, or even a corruption of, the authentic American music they embrace. The Newport Folk Festival had been a showcase for traditional folk and blues since its founding in 1959, and Bob Dylan is slated to be the headliner of Newport 1965. Joe Boyd is the production manager of the festival and attends a meeting where board member Peter Yarrow makes a last-minute appeal to make room on the schedule for one more act.
At this meeting, Peter Yarrow got up on his soapbox and he made a speech about the Butterfield Band, that this is what's happening right now. This is the most important band in America today. And Yarrow's argument was that with Sam and Jerome, that this was the revival meeting the authentic. This is where the folk festival has to be in order to be relevant. This is the summer of 1965. We can't live forever in the past. This is no longer the province just of the folkies.
So out on stage on this little flat platform comes Paul Butterfield on harmonica, of course, the amazing Michael Bloomfield on guitar, Elvin Bishop sort of undergirding everything with just killer rhythm guitar, Sam Lay on drums, and Jerome Arnold on bass. They just blew our little folky minds right off the charts. There's photos somewhere of us experiencing and reacting to this really raw, really vital Chicago blues sound, just full of power and energy, and we just loved it.
I'm probably 8 feet away from Butterfield's Fender amplifier. And he starts in a mellow down easy, bop, bop, on it, bop, 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 bop. And I'm like the guy from the Maxell commercial, because I'm in front of Butter's amp, and my scarf is like this, and I go, oh, look at that, you know. And we went electric the next day, our jug band.
in that time in the 60s, anyone who was at a folk festival already was for integration, and him playing in that integrated band was a statement that we're all in this together and we all love this music and we're all going to hang out together and we're getting rid of segregation and you just better get used to it.
You gotta mellow down easy, baby. You gotta mellow down easy, baby, before you blow your top.
The first time I saw Paul was at Newport, 1965, at the workshop, where Alan Lomax introduced the band in some very demeaning way.
And I know Lomax was already muttering and grumbling about that because he wasn't very positive about them. And he had, Robert Pete Williams and Son House and a really great lineup of acoustic black blues musicians.
And he did not like the idea, A, of drums at Newport, and B, of white people playing blues music.
And finally he says, okay, you've seen the real thing. Now here's some kids from Chicago going to come and try to play the blues with the help of these amplifiers, all these electric amplifiers.
At which point Grossman is so pissed off he jumps on Alan Lomax, and these two like panda bears in personality but grizzly bears in physique start rolling in the dirt together.
Full fisticuffs while the band was playing.
Throwing roundhouse punches at each other.
And then they were wrestling each other, and then they were rolling
around in the dirt.
And, it was lamentable and it was funny.
Dust flying, and these two, bears were scuffling, and that really felt good because that's what a manager ought to do.
In the middle of all of this, of course, was the fact that we'd been told by Grossman that morning that Dylan was going to play with the Butterfield rhythm section. Sam, Jerome, and Bloomfield, and Goldberg, and Cooper.
Saturday night, we rehearsed all night. I could only get 3 songs in that time period. And so the plan was that we were going to go up and play the 3 songs, because that's all we knew.
There was a mixed reaction from the audience. And a lot of people said they were boos, but there were also cheers too. There were people that did get it, but most of the boos came from the folkies, who felt betrayed, that Bob had betrayed them, and they sort of had a sense that their movement, that the folk movement was on its way out as well.
The funny thing is that he wasn't booed off stage. That was the ridiculous part of it. There was maybe 2 rows of people in this entire concert, which was packed, that were booing because they didn't want to hear him do electric music. They wanted to hear him do nothing but folk music.
This whole purist thing that was going on at that time, nobody got upset when Muddy Waters plugged in his guitar. It's just a false barrier that people who think they know about this stuff feel they have to pontificate about. It was the natural evolution of the earlier blues, and it was absolutely as valid as anything else.
The Butterfield band came up to play the Club 47 right after Newport, and at that time we charged $1 at the door. You could squeeze 110, 20 people into that place. People like Tom Rush or the Queskin Jug Band or those people, they would fill that place and they would get $75. So I think we were going to pay Paul's band $100 a night, $300 for 3 nights. This was Mike Bloomfield, Elvin Bishop, the whole band.
Well, my second band went down 21 years later.
Of course, the volume was pretty loud. Not by maybe today's standards, but by that time standard, the Butterfield band had a lot of punch. This band was hitting on all cylinders, and we'd never had anything like it in that room. I was the manager, and I had a little tiny office. And he'd come back into my office, and we had an absolute policy, and it was a real policy too. No smoking of dope in this place. Can't have it. There was no alcohol. There was no dope. If you want to have a drink, you could go across the street. There was a bar. And we just couldn't have it, because if we get closed down, we just couldn't have it. Paul come back into my office and he closed the door and he said, "Hey, man, I just have to have something before I go on." I said, "No, Paul, we can't do it." He was just like a cat that wouldn't let you go, you know, just whining and at you, you know, and I finally caved in, you know. Okay, well, a couple of puffs, that's it.
I played a night with them at the Cafe Au Go-Go on the sidelines, as I used to do at the twist parties, gazing at the kneecaps of the band, or lower. And then not long after that, I went to this session, and then Paul inducted me into the band.
After that first record, Albert Grossman came and gave us each a $1,000 bill. Tremendously impressive.
Paul's band, that first album that really took off, that opened the market up a lot to a lot of young white kids who hadn't really heard the blues, because once you heard Paul, you wanted to hear the other guys, Muddy and Wolf, and you got easily pulled into it.
Bloomfield came from a wealthy family, and one of his uncles had a pawn shop, and I used to not have any money, so I'd get my guitar as cheap as I could. I'd go to the pawn shop. And I went to one on Clark Street one time, and this kind of smart-ass looking kid behind the counter, you know, and I said, "Can I see that guitar?" He hands it to me, and I start playing my little blues licks, a few of them, you know. He said, "You like blues?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Give me that thing." He starts playing Rings Around the World, you know, just playing all these fancy licks and stuff. I said, "Oh, wow, that's great," you know. He'd get in your face and he'd just be spitting on you while he was talking and stuff, you know. He was just he had a tremendously active mind and really intense about everything he did, not just the playing, everything.
Michael was always intimidated by Paul. His personality was so strong, and you really couldn't get, you know, underneath Paul and get to know him well. You know, he really didn't let people in that much. Just his presence alone was a tough guy. Black leather jacket, a beer drinker. He was like a blues man, the real deal.
See, I had never worked with Paul for a long time because I never figured we'd get along personality-wise, you know, because Paul's a very, very hard guy, period, just a hard individual. He's very rock hard inside his body and everything. He has completely taken that harmonica and reworked it. In my opinion, Butterfield is the finest blues harmonica player in the world. And this is the first gig I've ever worked with Paul. And I tell you, man, you'll hear this band after this 2-month tour. There won't be a blues band in the history of the world that's going to come near this band.
I met Bloomfield on the Highway 61 sessions for Dylan. And he told me as we got friendly that he was in Paul's band. And that was one of the reasons why he didn't want to tour with Dylan, so he could stay in Paul's band. He said, "You'll make all kinds of money and, you know, be on the cover of Newsweek." He said, "But I just want to play the blues." He says, "And I'm having a great time doing it in this band." He turned down Bob Dylan to play with Butterfield. It's about as good as you can get.
Whenever Paul would appear in New York City, usually at a club called the Cafe Au Go-Go, we would always get there early and we would sit like right in the front row. And we'd do that night after night, show after show. He just played, you know. That was it. I think that that's probably when he was complete, you know, is when he was up there, eyes closed, blowing that perfect note.
And there's that soul there that is pouring out of everything that Paul did. It's not about how good or how not good or technique or this. The thing that to me makes Paul different is there's always this edge of soul that's always happening no matter whether he's singing or playing.
And another thing, you know, Paul played the harmonica upside down. A lot of people didn't know that. You know, where instead of the low notes on the left, they were on the right. Paul did it different. That band was the most powerful band I've ever heard.
We played another extended engagement. It was in a place called the Unicorn, and this was in Boston. Sam got sick, and that's when he got Billy Davenport. And he was quite logically, as a black man, concerned about what he was going to confront as he traveled America. And he told me that Paul said to him, "Where you can't go, we won't go." And he was proud of it, and it meant something to him that he got that guarantee. And it says something about Paul. There was a climate in the band, a musical climate that was now opening up. Musicians were taking on some of the attributes of jazz musicians and playing more extended things and experimenting.
In 1966, America is a cauldron of social and political change, fueled in large part by the music of the times. The Butterfield Blues Band's sprawling tapestry of an LP called East West, with its combination of electric blues and psychedelic rock, puts the band at the forefront of the music scene. Clocking in at a nearly unprecedented 13 minutes, the title track is a pioneering cross-cultural opus. Near mythical accounts of live performances of East West lasting over 40 minutes and leaving fans transfixed reverberate throughout the international rock music community.
They started doing East-West and messing with different modes to play in so that it sounds more Middle Eastern or something like that. You know, the fact that he wasn't satisfied just to be one of the world's best blues harp players, you know, he didn't lock himself in a box. He just kept taking it further.
Bloomfield used to do a fire eating routine. He'd do that, he'd get one of these things like looks like the mallet you play the kettle drum with, you know, and he'd squirt lighter fluid on it, light it up, spread his legs out, and that groove would be going, you know, behind him, and he'd lean way back and eat fire. And those old stoned out hippies would just lose their minds.
So here we are in Chicago at the Museum of Science and Industry. This is the photo shot of my father's iconic album. This is the cover of the second album, East-West. You had Jerome Arnold, Elvin Bishop, Mark Naftalin, Billy Davenport, Michael Bloomfield, and Paul Butterfield. This is a museum. This is a really, really odd place for a cover of a blues album. Maybe the fact that they actually got up here and took these photos here is expressing that band as someone who means business and saying, hey, baby, we're not what you think we are.
Oh, I mean, the authenticity was just astonishing. And playing through that amplifier and the tonality and the choices that he made were so unconventional and so, you know, innovative. I think that Paul was an incredible creative spirit and always kept stretching, you know. I mean, as deep as he would go into the roots, he was always pushing the envelope of what blues could be. Great arranger, put together an incredible band. Those guys wouldn't play with him if he wasn't that badass. I had lots and lots of harp players sitting with me, and nobody could blow like Butter. And I loved his singing as much as I loved his harp playing. You know, he's cute, too, as us girls like to call him.
Butterfield was very funny and had a very dry sense of humor and a kind of a smart-ass, wise-ass sense of humor, too. I remember remarking on Sam Lay's shoes, which were kind of metallic, and they were kind of like had little glass crystals in the shoes. And Paul said, "Don't get too close to him. He uses those to just put his foot and look up your skirt." And I don't know if it was true, but I believed Paul at the time.
Oh, Butter could be a little bit of a dirty dog from time to time. And Rothschild had some kind of legal troubles involving weed, which is pretty serious in those days, you know. And we were doing a session in New York City, and everybody took off for lunch and went out to get something to eat. And Rothschild stayed there, and he was fooling with the tapes, you know, and the faders, and he was at the console and everything, drinking a milkshake. And Butterfield came back and knocked real loud on the door and said, "Police!" Rothschild freaked out and spilled his milkshake in the console.
I'm very proud as the owner of the famous Golden Bear.
Woke up this morning, I looked round for my shoes.
In August of 1966, I booked them only for 1 week, but they stayed for 2, and I enjoy it very much. That was 20 shows, 350 people, and still the place was packed. This is unbelievable.
George, yeah, he was cool. George, a Greek guy. I used to go fishing at that pier across the street from the Golden Bear and bring it back, and George would cook it in the pizza oven, you know?
With Paul Butterfield, I had the perfect opening act. The comedian Steve Martin.
So I went to stay with my one of my college roommates. We were going up the stairs to their apartment, and Paul was coming down the stairs with a laundry basket. And we sort of met on the staircase and then sort of moved back down to the sidewalk, and we just started talking and talking and talking and talking. And he had a new album he wanted me to hear. And so he went and put it on, and it was the Beatles. Well, he kept playing me the song called "Got to Get You Into My Life." Sort of was a hint. I just had turned 21. He was only 23. Because I was on the road with them for probably 3 years. Like, people would say, "How long is your tour?" And I'd go, "I don't know. It's been going on for 340 days. I mean, we used to look at a matchbox in the drawer of the hotel to see where we were. It was like going from box to box to box. You're in an airplane, you're in a car, you're in a hotel, you're at the gig, you're at the hotel, you're in a car, you're in an airplane, you're in a train. You're just living in a box and a box and a box and a box and a box, and you're just so disorienting, you don't even know where you are. And these guys are just working hard every single day.
Kathy and Paul and the band spent all of 1966 on the road, playing at colleges, clubs, and concert halls. The band has a huge following in San Francisco, thanks to concert promoter and impresario Bill Graham, who books them into multiple venues during each visit. And Graham's growing friendships with Paul and Michael Bloomfield would bring additional benefits.
When Michael and Paul left Chicago, went to San Francisco, they had recommended to Bill Graham to get artists like Howlin' Wolf and Muddy and Little Walter James Cotton to come to California. So that even opened a greater audience for all these artists.
That gave the blues artists an opportunity to play someplace besides clubs, better paying gigs.
Paul was really heartbroken when Michael left the band. Paul was like, "No, we've got a good thing going. Let's keep up with this. You know, this is really a great combo." So it was hard.
I got to play more lead. I liked that, and I'd say quite a bit more ready than I would have been, you know, at the beginning.
Paul played a great set at Monterey. That was sort of his big debut of horns. And he had good horn players.
Gene Dinwiddie, the tenor player, and Keith Johnson, the trumpet player, came in, and Bugsy Mao came in.
Does that little girl even think of me?
Summer of '67, my wife and I and young baby went out to San Francisco. Never been west of the Mississippi. I run into Philip Wilson, my friend, a drummer, totally by accident on the street. I go, Philip, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I just joined this band, the Butterfield Blues Band. And he said, well, we're playing at the Fillmore. He said, come on down. So I came down, heard the band play, met the guys in the band, went the next night. And Philip said, hey man, we're going down to LA, we're gonna make a record. Basically hitchhiked to Hollywood, got to the Sandy Koufax's Tropicana Hotel. You know, I'm hanging out in the studio and Paul says, hey man, where's your horn? I said, well, it's back at the hotel. He said, why don't you go get it and maybe you can play a little bit. So I'm like, holy fuck. I sit in, Paul likes the sound of it. I was in show business.
In life, people move on. Everybody's band changes. That's just part of being in a band. New life.
It was all peaceable, no hard feelings between anybody. Butter didn't want me to leave, but I did because you play one or two songs, you know, the dynamics of band getting along is you got to give everybody a little piece of the action, you know, so you get to do one or two songs a night that are really close to your heart, you know. And then the idea starts working on you. What if I got to do all songs that are real close to my heart, you know? And it works, and it works, and it works. And after a while, the desire to do that overcomes the fear of leaving, and there you go.
And to be on stage with him, it was like a hurricane. The sound was ferocious. I mean, I have never before or after heard a sound like that, ever. He was a force of nature on that instrument. Everybody else sounded just kind of timid. It's almost like a snarl he had. He just went for it, you know? And I think that was really inspiring to me as a player. It was my introduction to the idea that it's better to reach for something and miss it than just to hold back and play it safe.
Paul Butterfield never played the same thing twice, nor did the band play the same way twice. The whole thing about playing for the moment is that you could do the same song a million times, and a million times it's going to be different because you're not being generic about it. That's what makes an artist an artist.
He lived, breathed, ate, and spoke music. I mean, English was really his second language. Music was his first language. And so that's how he communicated with the world.
All aboard!
Fathers and Sons, 1969.
We decided to do half of it in the studio, 3 days of studio, and then that live concert. The concert was great. It was in this just restored classical music hall in Chicago, the Chicago Auditorium.
This was a chance to feature the great Muddy Waters, and it was a way to pay them back. We felt it was our duty, our job, to make sure that we paid back what we learned from these guys. That's what that Fathers and Sons was all about, paying homage to Muddy, saying, you're the father, we're the sons, you treated us good, Dad.
Muddy was Paul's mentor and guide, and he was like a second dad to him. Musically, he brought him up.
The concert was great. It was rocking and jumping. It was really that first people from Big John's. It was all those thousands of people who over the months and years had gone to Big John's. They were at that concert, man. Every single one of them was at that concert. You know, the blues guys just loved this influx of the white market buying it, the white kids playing it. The blues was moving on.
Everybody's radar was up in that band. Everybody was listening to everybody else. It wasn't planned. It was like everyone was channeling this creative force. And Butterfield was the guy. You know, he was the guy that set the tone. You know, he was like, we're going for it. Because that's where he came from. He came from the south side of Chicago, where it was about, I'll kick your ass. Every time he stepped up to the microphone, he played like it was the last time he was ever going to play.
He was a real blues guy, you know? He meant it every time. Come on, I mean, if you listen to his playing, it's just pure. You know, you wonder, how does a guy get that out of a little Marine band harmonica? You know, I mean, that's special stuff.
The horn parts were put together by just sitting down and playing. That band got to the point when one person played a part that was good, all the other parts fell into place immediately. It was kind of a magical band. It was magical.
That band was one of the first, if not the first, mixed band where it was true equality in that band. There was no racial anything. We ended up in situations that were in parts of the country, for instance, when we were touring, that didn't see it like that. You know, like blacks were not accepted everywhere, and to see a mixed band, especially guys with long hair and hanging with black guys, we were really a threat. They looked at us like communists. There were some near physical confrontations with Butterfield because he would get in people's face. You know, they would vibe us or they'd make a comment, you know, like niggers and all that. And he would get right in their face and say, motherfucker, let's go outside right now. Come on, let's go, you know. And so, you know, we had to kind of drag him out of a few places, you know, where it was like that. So he really stood up for what he believed in.
He had gifts. He had brilliant, beautiful gifts. And because of those gifts, he changed the world for many people, helping to bring that blues out to the rest of the world when the African Americans weren't able to do that. It wasn't a welcoming place.
I thought, I don't give a damn. If you play right, I don't care what color you have a pink stripe running down back if you want to. Yeah. I ain't bragging on us, but I didn't see nobody else who was better. And we happen to be black and white.
Most people don't realize that Woodstock started as an artist colony in about 1903. And it was established as a utopian arts and crafts community. But around the 1960s is when it kind of came into its own, before the actual big Woodstock festival that everybody knows about. Peter Yarrow had a family house here, and through him, Albert Grossman came with his stable of artists. So, of course, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and later Bob Dylan, and Paul, of course, was one of those people that came along with Albert.
Sometimes it felt like someone just dropped some kind of pill and watered it, and you know, a different Woodstock popped up overnight, seemingly. you know, and it was very exciting, especially for someone like myself who's young and loving music, and all of a sudden, you know, there's head shops, there's leather shops, you know, no more electric stores, now it's the leather shop, you know. The practical kind of went out the window, and the magical came in. And one of the people riding that artistic and musical wave was Paul Butterfield.
Getting down Highway 28, slow me down, don't make me late. I got a gig in Woodstock, yeah, playing off of my shoes inside now.
Paul bought a house up the road from my folks, a little farmhouse and a barn. Paul was well known as a blues musician, but he didn't have any affect about him ever. He fit in well with the local people.
He was our neighbor, and it was a true neighbor. We had barbecues. We had him for brunch and breakfast. We went to his place. He was a great cook, by the way. He made a barbecue ribs with a mustard sauce that was out of this world. He told me someday he would give me the recipe. He never did. I worked at night. Now, when he saw my light on, he would pull in the driveway, and I gave him the nickname the Moth because of that. And as a result, he would come in. We had a stand-up upright piano at the time, and he'd start playing right away, and I'd get some Commemorativo for him, his favorite tequila, and we'd have a little midnight, not midnight, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning session.
Paul came in with his big horn band with Dave Sanborn, Gene Dinwiddie, Philip Wilson, I believe, on drums, and there was a time when Paul and that band played at the Cafe Espresso in Woodstock on Wednesday nights. They sort of like did it like a rehearsal. It was just phenomenal.
Hey, so far, so good. Love affair has been so good, so far.
Paul had an idyllic life in Bearsville in the early 70s. He was a successful performer, with a successful band, a successful record, and everything was looking up for him. He had a beautiful wife, Kathy, and they had a beautiful child, Lee, and he was another happy, bouncing, blonde baby boy. And he had Albert. He owned Bearsville. He found Paul this property. He had a beautiful barn, old red barn was painted beautifully, where I took those pictures of him mowing the lawn, big lawn. Took a lot of work. You know, this is the American dream. And I've never seen him happier. The whole situation was very nice.
You know, when we lived in Woodstock, we had horses, we had dogs, we had cats, we had all this stuff. We had an organic farm, we had so many tomatoes, we'd stand at the back door and throw them out after I made ketchup and tomato sauce and everything else I could think of.
We had 11.5 acres and a stream that ran through our property, you know, we had beautiful horses.
We had this raccoon. She used to like lie on her back and Paul would scratch her tummy and play with her, and everything was like an art project.
You know, one of the best memories that I have of Paul is when he came to do a session with us at the Bearsville Studios, when we put together this group called the Woodstock Mountains Review. And he came up, it was the middle of a snowstorm, and he walked in and he went into the studio at Bearsville with John Sebastian, and the two of them pulled out their harmonicas, and they did the most beyond belief version of Amazing Grace with just the two of them as a harmonica duet. And I don't know if they had ever played it together before, but it was so perfect. And we were all sitting there just completely open-mouthed and silenced by this incredible thing. And then it was over. Paul got in his Jeep and went back down the mountain.
Paul was one of the more what I call generous musicians to play with. He would do a solo, but he would also set you up. It was just like, come on, let's play. You know, let's have a conversation together.
It was Paul that first encouraged me to let my blues voice out. And he would just tell me, don't worry about sounding pretty or like singing fancy blues licks or anything. Just let your voice out. And so that was so encouraging. To this day, I have him to thank, because now, many years later, I have a blues voice, and that's how I've always wanted to express myself. And he was the first person to give me permission and encouragement to do that.
Paul was always a historian as well as just a straight musician. He revered the people who came before him and that he learned from. Paul talked about the harmonica players that he loved on a series of instructional cassettes that we made, now on CDs.
Hi, this is Paul Butterfield. I'd like to help bring some new insights into the harmonica, if I could. Those notes can be used in so many different ways, in so many different colors. They're just beautiful colors to that instrument. I thought it would be a nice idea to talk about some of the influences on my playing, people that I heard in Chicago growing up. One thing that they all had in common, there was a certain urgency to their playing. There was a certain tension to the way they played the notes, some more than others. Junior Parker was very relaxed in his playing. He sort of played like... Whereas Sonny Boy Williams had a very stark, kind of hard way of saying things on the harmonica. Little Walter was very fluid kind of lines, and
I was thrilled, and I am thrilled to this day, that we were able to capture that, because I think it's unique to have a record like that of his musical thinking and his musical experience for the learning player.
He influenced, a zillion people on harmonica, certainly. And that wasn't enough. Then he was such a great singer.
Every time he sang, you could hear it coming out of his soul. Every song, I could never tell if he was feeling good one day or feeling bad one day. He just played from his soul every time.
Paul had this incredible power in his voice, and it was kind of that Irish tenor thing. He had sort of an Irish tenor voice, but there was some kind of force behind it that came from some other place.
One of the songs we sang was Play On, and it rocked. It was, he's just so great, it's just so soulful. And he can give you the blues, and he can give you the rock and roll, he can give you the soul, Really, I thought he was black. Some of the little inflections that he does sounds like Jimi Hendrix, and then when he goes that, long, that's Ray Charles, It's very soulful, makes you want to move, He sounds great and looks great.
Sometimes I Just Feel Like Smiling is Paul's 7th and final album on Elektra. With its main focus on the Doors and other more commercially successful artists, the label drops Paul. Jim Rooney, now in Woodstock managing Bearsville Studios, has a small office upstairs in the Bearsville complex.
So I was up there one day, and Paul came in, and he was on the phone to this guy, Joe Baskin at Holiday Travel, booked all of our travel, anybody through Albert's groups. He was working every weekend with that band. I think Friday, Saturday, Sunday, three dates a week, and then they'd come home and they'd be home during the week, which was a nice way to live. So he was looking for the tickets, hadn't gotten the tickets for the weekend. And he says, "What do you mean they haven't been paid?" And the bills hadn't been paid for a good long while. I believe by this point Janis Joplin had died, and it seems to me that the wind went out of Albert's sails a bit, and the next thing I know, the Butterfield band is dissolved. And it happened really fast.
And that's a huge blow. And I never heard him say any bad word about Albert. They were good friends. In my own mind, I just don't think Paul ever recovered from that.
Standing by the highway.
Paul's career is in limbo. Albert Grossman offers him a recording contract with his label Bearsville Records, which has just signed a distribution agreement with Warner Brothers. With no other offers on the table, and with Bearsville's new state-of-the-art recording studios less than 3 miles from his house, Paul accepts.
1972, I think it was Albert's idea to, here's Paul, you know, maybe in between bands, wondering what he's going to do. He's got this contract. Albert got little Amos, what a gorgeous sound Amos had. So now you got the three of us. Then in comes this guy, Ronnie Barron. The guy was a character. He had this great funky energy, which Paul made our own hybrid of that kind of sound. And it worked perfectly. I think we got Topher next, Christopher Parker. In came Bill Rich, and it was over. I remember in the beginning when we were looking for drummers and bass players and stuff for Better Days, and he'd check bands out. Sometimes he'd sit in. And it wouldn't matter what band was playing, whether it be at that joint or anywhere else. If he sat in and they were grooving, as soon as he played 3 notes, the groove was way better. That was his magic. He'd just do ba ba ba, and you're in. We made one very good album with that band. I'm very proud of it. 2.5 years. I think we had a quick burnout. I don't know how it happens. You know, you hear stories about the Eagles and stuff, and then they have a meeting and they pull it all together and they all go straight, you know, and they put somebody in a rehab and then they go on for another 10 years, you know. It didn't happen to us.
In general, the times were definitely a-changing, and all the benign pot smoking that we'd done in the 60s and early 70s was giving way to harder stuff, and people were now getting turned on to coke and using a lot of it. And I remember that Jeffrey and Paul, I just saw them really kind of living out their macho rock star dreams. And, you know, playing the part by doing extra levels of drug taking and drinking. And it just escalated and escalated, and then, you know, started having kind of a darker and darker side after a while.
Kathy must have been a calming force for Paul. You know, we were partying so hard. And she was probably extremely forgiving of the boogie woogie, you know, because we'd roll in from closing all the bars, and that wasn't the end of the night at all. You know, as many dawns were coming, you know. And there was one morning where he burst into tears about how much he loved Kathy. To me, it meant that he felt bad about something, you know. Like he wasn't being as good a man for her as he could have been. But I don't think anybody could ever consider thinking about Paul sitting there bawling, weeping, you know. And I probably just said, hey, let's have another drink.
Paul's first 2 Bearsville releases, with Better Days in 1973, sell well and receive favorable reviews. The band is constantly on the road, but they break up in 1974. Paul uses the downtime to catch up on requests for his services as a session player and guests on albums by Bonnie Raitt and others. He's invited to be a musical guest at the Last Waltz, a concert advertised as the band's farewell appearance, held at Bill Graham's Winterland in San Francisco on Thanksgiving 1976, featuring Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Eric Clapton, Ron Wood, and Paul's old friend Muddy Waters. The event is filmed by director Martin Scorsese and released as a documentary in 1978.
I remember how proud he was of that. They could have shown you the old Last Waltz record, and he said to Lee, "Love Daddy," and wrote me a thing. I remember him just being so proud of that record, I mean, what a great lineup, right? It's just unreal.
Paul used to appear quite regularly with Levon Helm and the RCO All-Stars, and that was just a floating party of amazing musicians.
Come on, pretty baby, won't you walk with me? Come on, pretty mama, won't you talk with me? Come on, pretty baby, give me one more chance to try to save our romance. Slow down. You know you're moving way too fast. You better give me a little love, give me a little hug, if you want our love to last.
The Danko Butterfield band was really a monster combination, and the shows that I saw and the ones that we got to play with, where there wasn't a musician that wasn't rapt attention at the side of the stage. Totally unique voices on their instruments, and just as people and their personalities, they sparked each other really well. They just had the stuff,
I know Paul, as time went on with his contract with Beresford Records, became unhappy with the promotion that Beresford was doing. Albert was very involved in building his restaurants and the Beresford complex, and Paul felt that he was affected by that.
It was difficult for Paul because he was all about music. He didn't have that political instinct.
His decline took place over a long period of time, and it was very difficult to see.
Our relationship had become somewhat distant just because I lived in one place, more or less, and he lived in lots of places. And he would call me, often at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And in terms of his phone calls, how distressed he seemed. That was an important part of my knowing. I mean, I knew he was having some difficulties, but the phone calls would say, "Okay, I'm doing better now," or "Okay, I'm doing worse now."
After we had Lee, we kind of settled down more. I mean, Paul would still go on the road, and it was harder for him then. It was fragmenting. That's when it started getting really kind of fragmented.
It was heartbreaking, They were madly in love with one another. I was a young kid. People didn't have the same awareness of how dangerous drugs and alcohol can be, and how they can completely twist someone's mind and their priorities, and where to go to get some help with this. How do we work it out? And there's no question in my mind that she was worried. My dad was not an abusive person. He didn't hurt people. He wasn't that kind of scary. But he was surrounded by as many yes men as he felt like being surrounded by at any given time. There were people wanting to give him things just because they wanted to hang out with him. And I was a little kid. And that's lonely and hard to deal with, especially if you're raising a child and your husband's on the road all the time. I mean, my heart goes out to her, and what she must have felt. I think it was around 76 that she decided she had to leave Woodstock. Packed the car up and we drove out west. Not long after that, my dad came to, try to mend things. And he would come out and stay for periods of time. It is hard for me to think about that time in my life, because when you're asking your parent to be there for you and they're, in another place altogether, that's tough. He was still struggling, and he'd known nothing but the road since he was young, and I think he felt a bit lost. And he was still deeply in love, and I know how much he loved me, and we talked all the time. But he would make promises that he couldn't keep, and that kept breaking my heart. And to make light of it, my mom would say, "Oh yeah, it's not that your dad means to be late. It's Paul Butterfield time. Oh, okay, what? The tour manager changed it from March now to June." And that's being late, you don't bother to call and say, "I'm not going to be out there until this time," but I learned to really cherish the times that I get to go crash with him in a hotel room and get up in the morning and eat cold pizza and hang out at the sound checks and go on small tours with him. And, but it was also really tough.
In 1980, Paul is living in the Woodstock house with his girlfriend, musician Elizabeth Barraclough, and collapses while recording his North-South album in Memphis. He's diagnosed with peritonitis, a painful inflammation of the inner lining of the abdomen, typically caused by a bacterial infection. The condition is aggravated by Paul's heavy drinking, use of cocaine and heroin, and poor diet. He receives treatment for the rest of his life, including multiple surgeries.
I have a feeling that Jerry Lee Lewis was diagnosed with peritonitis before Paul was. Anyway, he seemed to be wearing it as a badge of honor. He was indomitable. He wasn't going to be slowed down by this at all, which is why toward the really end of his career, and I could begin to see signs that things were taking him down, and his lack of awareness, I think that was more heartbreaking than anything.
Christmas, it was the early 80s. He was in the emergency room at Kingston Hospital. His insides had dissolved. And just about died. And I made a point of coming up here in January. Kathy was gone by this point. He was with Elizabeth Barraclough. The house was empty. And I went over to see him. And by God, wasn't he at it again? And I said, I was so pissed off. I said, I came up here, I thought you were going to die. I said, I just can't believe this. I just can't believe it. And he did the old cute thing, oh, hey man, it's just, I'm not, it's just a little taste, It killed me.
Paul sells the Woodstock house, the last remaining symbol of his hard-earned success, in late 1981 and moves to New York City. While he still plays the occasional gig, he has no record contract and very little money. With the popularity of disco and other musical genres, the 80s is a tough time to be a blues musician. He spends much of his time hustling money for booze, cocaine, and heroin. He stays with friends when he can, but he's running out of friends. Then, opportunity arrives from an unexpected source when New York investment banker Ray Godfrey offers to finance a new album.
It was almost like a dream that there he was in the Gramercy Hotel where I was living. There was Paul Butterfield. and he was checking in, and he stayed for a good many months. He had a lot of demons, as we all know. One of them was he couldn't eat just anything. Certain items were off his diet, but he couldn't help himself. He loved and would shovel in the worst fried peppers, and he couldn't get enough of them. And I said to myself, man, that is living the blues. He lives the blues by totally putting himself through that on purpose, I think. Whatever Muddy Waters would have, however he would have written it, Paul lived it. That much we knew. He went off into the cosmos and into Eastern scales and experimental music, but never lost the soul of a Chicago blues man.
Caress me, baby, like the wind caress the tree. I want you to love me, baby, like a cool, soft summer breeze.
When Albert Grossman passed away on Super Bowl Sunday, 1986, it was a devastating day for those musicians, and I know Paul felt the same way. No matter what the music business was like at the time, Albert had been like a father to those musicians, and they were deeply affected.
In 1986, Paul moves to Los Angeles, not far from Kathy and Lee. While in constant pain from his peritonitis, he makes serious attempts to conquer his alcohol and drug dependency and regain control of his life. Rehab stints are only intermittently successful, but he continues to perform, and on stage, he always rises to the occasion.
It was April 15th, 1987. Paul went to Los Angeles to play on a B.B. King special with Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Albert King, Phil Collins, and Paul was not in good shape, and his alcoholism was worse and worse, and yet he stole the show.
He was just himself. He was a real man. He was one of the leaders in the harmonica business. But Paul was a young man, so it's left to you, me, and a whole lot of others to keep it going. We wouldn't be treating him fair if we didn't.
After post-production, it came out after Paul died, which was only less than a month later. And they posthumously dedicated that show to him. He came to Woodstock after that because he was going to get together with Rick for those shows in Woodstock and a little bit of a tour there. And Rick certainly had his own issues, and he was on those last shows with Paul, including the last show at Gravitas, a nightclub in Pittsburgh.
I was sleep like babies since my baby started. Low down way.
The morning after that show, I got a call from Rick at the hotel, and he told me the ambulance had come and picked up Paul, and he was unconscious at the hotel room. And Paul got admitted to the hospital there in Pittsburgh. They were concerned about him enough to hold him in the state of Pennsylvania at the hospital. And then he checked out and went to Hollywood. And he passed away, I believe it was May 4th, only about a week later.
I mean, he was the love of my life. And even though I had a lot of trouble with some of the things that were going on, I loved him dearly. And he loved me. And we had a very private and very close bond. Yeah, it was very, very sad to lose him.
I've done a lot of wrong things in my life. But that's all right. I'm not the only one. And I've done a lot of wrong things I was sure that was right. That's all right too. I had fun. Every now and then I find myself a sweet thing. Just to come and keep me company. And when I get low, I know right where to go. Someone's there to take good care of me.
He died the same age as I am right now, you know, and I feel young. I feel like my life is just starting. I've got such a beautiful family and so much love to give and so much to offer, and I can't possibly imagine my life ending now.
Paul didn't happen to fit into some view of where the zeitgeist was at that particular point, you know? And sometimes you just gotta lay low. You just gotta wait. And then the world makes a couple more turns and all of a sudden, you're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
My own experience with bluesmen is that something, some energy inside of them, I don't want to use the word pain, maybe it's joy, something has to come out. And they discover blues as their outlet. Boy, Paul was definitely one of those guys that you put that harp to his lips, man, and something from his soul.
I had the honor to be one of the speakers at Paul's memorial service here in Woodstock. And among the things I said was this, which I think sums up my feeling about Paul. And I'll read this to you. Paul used to say that he played only one note, but he really knew how to play it. Maybe that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but when he got in front of a microphone with a harmonica in his hand, he was transformed. Everything else was stripped away, the walls came down, and raw feelings came out. Underneath it all, that's where his true talent was, in his ability to play that note with so much heart that it couldn't miss, going right to the heart of anyone who listened.
And every now and then, I find myself a sweet thing. And just to come and keep me company. Whoa, whoa. And when I get low, I know right where to go. someone's there to take good care, take good care of me. Mary, Mary, where are you going to?